Thank you. Hello, guys. As they already mentioned, my name is Margarita. I am a consultant developer from Futurize. I am checking a diversity checkbox here today. So let's start with my presentation. Initially, I was going to talk about the generated code from different code bases, but then I realized the generated code is not representing the problem itself. It's more about how we work with the code and how we do the iteration and how we do the documentation. So today's talk is going to be about the dreaded D word of development, which is documentation, and how to do it the proper way, at least from my personal experience. So please raise your hand if you are one of those, consultant developer or a new developer on a project. Okay, good. So those are going to be quite relevant to you guys. I've been both, and I realized that through my working experiences, when you go and you're onboarded on a new project, the GitHub file looks something like this. Go F yourself. Because basically people have a lot of assumptions. They have a lot of assumptions about what kind of tech stack you've been working with. They have a lot of assumptions what kind of knowledge more junior developers should have. And I think so far the default mode, at least in here in Finland, is that if you don't know something, well, you should know. So that's your problem. So I think that's the wrong approach, and I think this is something that should change with time. I think Brad Frost has put it in a very nice words, like don't use just, especially when you onboard new people or when you do the docs, because just is a very dangerous word. It has a presumption that I'm familiar with the certain technology stack that I might not be. So how we can change it? When it comes to documentation on the web, people seem to remember about it only when there is a lack of it. And they have all sorts of excuses, and they're not limited to, but the most frequent excuses I've heard are the following. We didn't have budget, didn't allocate time to write docs. That's like number one excuse, not to write any documentation at all. The second one is everything is in package JSON. Why do I need to write it? Like, come on, just read through the shebang of the dependencies I have. New developers can always ask me. That's my favorite. Like, just ask me. It's all in the code base. Read comments, run tests. Basically, if the code was hard to write, it should be hard to read. And you know. It's your job as a developer to figure out how this works. I've been told this literally quite a couple of times. Why I think documentation actually matters when you're creating a new project and when you come on board on a new project. Because first, people who wrote code leave the project. So developers can always ask me, doesn't work in this scenario, right? People might not be familiar with certain tech stack, which is particularly common in the front end because there is different things across different platforms, and you can never assume people know about specific patterns. Junior developers have no idea what to do. They don't know what to do. I didn't know what to do when I was a junior developer. I don't think anybody does when they're just starting. On large projects, it's hard to keep everything in your head, which is 100% true. I stumbled upon this when I was working for the product company. There was a huge code base. Nobody knew what the heck was going on. That was problematic. So disclaimer is, this is my approach to writing documentation. But I think it kind of works, at least with my experiences working in Futurize, it kind of worked pretty fine. So there are two cases. The first case we have a short-term front-end project, so only 3 weeks. I was the only web developer there, hand over to a backend guy who has no idea what's going on in the front-end world. Because, I mean, technically all of the projects you hand over at some point to somebody, right? And then we have another case which is unrealistic MVP sprint, 3 weeks, some kind of a magic number in my life, I don't know. I'm a senior developer and I have an intern, and let me just say, being a senior developer with an intern is kind of like being a single mom on the project. You have to really watch what the kid is doing. So the first project I was doing there was the IT.ai website. Really cool guys, really nice guys. They have this startup that does AI solutions for you. I'm not trying to advertise that. They were just really nice to me, so that's why I'm telling about this. So the project was React.js frontend with some contentful integration. There was a Webpack 4 for bundling everything together. For the styles, I used Sass because why not? And documentation. Documentation was actually a big point in this project because I had to hand it over to the backend guy, as I said before, and it was very important so that he can do something and fix some minor parts of the project later on. So how do we do documentation without actually doing the documentation? Don't be like the guys from Git Lost. Please. This is actually a pretty nice Twitter account. Basically, it fetches the Git commit messages with the swear words in them, and don't do that. Write nice, comprehensive commit messages that would allow you to trace back the history and understand where you did what. A very good resource to read about it is how to write a Git commit message. It's a really nice tutorial. I actually introduced this to the interns on the project. They were quite happy, and now they do nice commit messages. Good issue descriptions and links to corresponding commit messages. That's extremely helpful, especially when you're doing some bug fixes. I think that's more relevant to the open source software, but still, I think in the generic software development, it's very nice to see whether specific features have been implemented or specific issues have been closed, which is why always link your commit messages to the issues. Well-created config files, that goes without saying really, but I've noticed that a lot of people kind of forget to clean up the package JSON after trying and failing with a couple of new libraries. So for that, remove the unused libraries from the package JSON, because NPM is kind of like a black hole of the development right now, very heavy. And the next one is have a clean, nicely made Webpack. Don't kind of try to patchwork it into one working config. Really, it's better to spend a little bit more time in the beginning to set up the bundling correctly and then forget about it than to kind of firefight it at all times while doing the actual development. Always code as if the guy who ends up maintaining your code will be a violent psychopath who knows where you live. I don't know who said this. I thought it was John Woods, but then I found quite a few attributions of this phrase on the internet. Let's pretend it was John Woods. But that's actually quite true. I think that a lot of developers kind of silently swear to the previous people who wrote the code base and saying, oh my God, this is so bad, this is like that. No. Actually, I had a very extreme case in my working experiences when I was handed over, it was a website, but then it didn't have any version control. I didn't have any docs at all, and there was like 8 different libraries that was handling like one on-click section in the message. That was quite painful to debug and understand how it worked. So I was quite near this psychopath phase to find him and kill him at that point. When it comes to documentation, README is always the king. Like if there is something I should know about the project when I get onboarded on this project, it always should be in the README. It should not be ping that DevOps guy on Slack who is going to answer you in 3 months about the server he forgot to set up. It should be in the README. So how do I propose to create the README structure? That was the approach that actually worked quite nicely for my 2 cases. So the most important information you should include is small project description, Literally 2 sentences, nothing fancy. Critical scripts, critical running scripts that you are currently using for launching Docker, launching the front end, launching whatever you need to be launched, fetching database, you name it. Links to blog posts used in the development if there are some advanced hacks or something, because let's face it, we all do that. We all read like a bunch of blog posts before we ship any code so that we can make it nicer. Architecture schema of the application, I think that's pretty clear. Critical hacks issues, as I've already said, if there is something that goes in the backlog, but then again that's pretty critical, or something was hotfixed, it should be either in the README or in the comments with the fix me prefix. ESLint guide. I personally always use Prettier, so that's not really a problem for me. I actually configured the Prettier Git hook so that nobody can commit the unprettified code, which has been working quite nicely for me so far. So I highly suggest you adding all kinds of ESLint guides, Prettier, Airbnb, Prettier, whatever makes your coding workflow much easier. Data model, it depends on the data really that you have, but having that in the documentation actually is very handy, because I even forget from time to time what kind of the structure of the data there is, and knowing that it's going to be there when I visit the README is a very consoling thing. DevOps setup, Docker, whatever you're using for the DevOps, works pretty nicely. So as the examples, this is the example of small project description. As you can see, nothing fancy really, just a couple of words to have an initial idea where you landed. Crucial scripts, that's one example. It can of course be more than that, but it worked for me. Links to blog posts used in the development. For example, I found this really nice library that I used to generate the web icon for different devices, so I decided to include the approach I used with the blog post link. Architecture schema, this is usually something that I do for the application so that other guys, especially the guys that come from the backend, can understand like how to, for example, do the DevOps in the project. They know that everything that will be on the actual website will be in the build folder, so they're aware of this and they can build the DevOps around this kind of setup. Critical hacks. Well, this is not quite a hack, but for example, I used the magic for the image modification. So I wrote this quite a big script that would cut down the size of the images used in the projects, and this is not something that should be run every time the application launches, but rather for the image that you include in the website. So I just decided to put it in the docs. Improvement suggestions. I think it's good kind of backlog-ish situation, because nobody knows better than you how to improve your app, right? So you can actually paste there some improvement suggestions that developers can later learn from when they get onboarded on the project. Markdown editing for Sublime Text. There is a to-do file that I usually include in the application folder. To-do file is basically a to-do list that I keep for myself, because I really don't like to switch in between the GitHub issues, GitHub commits, Trello, and it seems to be quite messy for me. So I usually have like one small to-do file in my own application that I get like the referrals to once in a while. Front-end MD, there is actually a way to automatically generate some pieces of documentation, which I really suggest you to benefit from, because it saves you time and it saves you the energy instead of doing some manual work or writing it yourself. There are actually really great tools for doing component documentation if you're using React. Can you raise your hand if you're using React, writing any React application here? Okay. So basically, Storybook is not only meant for React, but the primary use case is basically the reactive one. If you're using Angular and Vue, and you can also use Storybook for that. But basically, Storybook allows you to create your component libraries. And it actually has quite a few nice side effects that I will mention in this presentation later, but Storybook is really nice. I really recommend you to check it out. Something that is like Storybook but not quite Storybook, React Style Guidist. The documentation is not the best one out there, I'd say, for the style guidist, but the tool is still really nice. It works very similar to Storybook in a way that it allows you to document your components in the application, so I really suggest you to take a look at it. Unexpected benefits of using Storybook with React. I'm just reading from the slides right now. Great. Anyways, in my latest project that I've been doing with an intern, I've been using Storybook quite heavily for documenting how the component should look like in different states. And I discovered quite a few nice side effects of using Storybook. I would say nice benefits of using this, and I will walk you through. So for developers, using Storybook is easy to create component library to have as a reference, meaning that it's not actually going to be anything executable, but rather a sandboxed, moded component that's isolated from the other noise of your application. It's nice to test, easy to create components in isolation. Senior devs can concentrate on more important tasks such as data model and data flow and not think too much about how the components will look like in the application from the start, which will allow them to create more complex architecture. And the concept of the Storybook quite nicely forces you to use atomic approach in your application design. For junior developers, basically this is what I've been using to teach interns, and it's been working quite nicely so far. Because they're quite new to the development process and the application itself, I don't really want to kind of scare them with the data flows and how the Redux works and how we can match these things together because they're just starting. So what I did is I asked them to create a few components in an sandbox isolated Storybook server, meaning that they were just creating React components, completely isolated from all of the noises. They could practice saying how the props were passed, how to manage the state. It was a very nice task for them. Like the next stage would be they would create more complex components. The next stage would be they would kind of mash them together, and then actually in the end try them with the data and seeing how all of this shebang works. And it was a very nice exercise. I believe it's very useful. As I said, juniors can fiddle with the project structure in a sandbox mode without actually interfering with the application. A very nice side effect of it is that they were actually able to contribute to the application from day one, because there is nothing easier than just creating a React component, right? You just like create a button or like a paragraph or, I don't know, some markup. Basically, since they could do this in a sandbox mode without interfering with the data, they just created some pure presentational components. This helped me, and they learned something. That was really nice. Using style components with Storybook allows for the complete CSS isolation. Well, that might be an overstretch, but using style components with React and Storybook actually allows you to encapsulate the CSS of the specific components, which makes them the purest presentation layer of all times, which is actually a very good pattern for, I've been talking too much. It's actually a very good pattern for the atomic design in the application. For designers have visibility of components. So what we did, we set up the DevOps flow where the Storybook server would be open on a separate URL that designers could access. they could see our progress of how the application was progressing, how many more components from their Zeppelin library we have already created. Since this is a server, they could fiddle inside of the browser with those components and see if there were some problems with the responsiveness, for example, or maybe the text were too big, or you name it. So for designers, it was actually quite helpful to see how the components they created in Sketch would interact in the browser in real life. Generated code is not the pure evil. This is something that I learned from trying out Figma code generation. Who here is familiar with Figma? Okay, for those who don't know, it's like Sketch, but online, and you can generate React components from there. Ringing any bells? Okay. If you haven't tried it out, I really suggest you to try it out, because I've been using Figma to sketch my thesis application quite a lot, and I would say it's very nicely development-friendly UI for creating UI components, and it's completely online. As a conclusion, I'd like to paraphrase the Tom Ford's phrase. He said, dressing well is a form of good manners. I'd like to say that good documentation is a form of good manners among developers, and we should really invest a little bit of our time to make it nice for the next people to come. Thank you. Questions? Questions? Okay. Yes.
Can you share some advice how to sell documentation to the customers?
Sell documentation?
Or the time that you spend on writing documentation, because it has to be paid.
Okay. I think it really depends on the customer. Like, I don't think there is a silver bullet for that, but I suggest that, for example, Storybook is kind of the documentation without actually doing the documentation, meaning that you do document your components that you have in your application, for instance, but you're still creating those components. And you are going to share them with the designers either way. It depends on the workflow, I guess, because some designers are not present during the development workflow. But in general, using Storybook is one way to create documentation without creating the documentation. So the purpose of selling this to somebody is kind of not there anymore. But if you really want to spend time on the documentation and build it from the customer, I'd say the best argument would be, well, you would have to hire developers someday to maintain it, and it's going to be cheaper for you in the long run. Smart people will get it. Did I answer your question?
Maybe I should think of trying this last phrase for the next.
Okay. Yes?
The folder structure stuff. Did you just have a tool to generate it, or did you have to manually go in?
I don't have a tool to generate it. Maybe there's probably is a tool to generate it, but I just do it manually because I have this habit of putting this from the beginning of the project. Something that I maybe forgot to say, that if you're going to do documentation, you should do it from the start of the project, because once you have done half of the app and you have 56 components and your Redux flow is there, it's too late to start doing any documentation. So if you're doing this, the best case scenario, you're starting doing this on a greenfield project. Any more questions? No? Okay, yeah, sure.
So how much do you believe in this self-documenting code thing? Or if you would have some separate documentation, actually write out text files and you have the code, then how would you balance it if you're at least trying to document everything on the code side, leaving a lot of comments, leaving good JS doc?
Well, I think having good naming in place of the components and variables is a very good start. I think not using any hacks and just doing everything with the libraries is also one way to do docs without doing docs. As I said, something that is quite crucial and something that's hacky should go in the documentation, meaning that the documentation itself shouldn't be a major time consumer in the development process. But some stuff should definitely be there that is quite critical, and that basically if there is something that if there is something on a project that you kind of feel like you should know but you keep forgetting, this should go in the docs. That's the rule of thumb. But I don't believe in the code that's like completely doesn't need the documentation at all. It's like so perfect. It doesn't need documentation. I've never seen that. Maybe it exists, but I've never seen it before. Thank you.